All right, so thanks for being here at our EMR Research Insights Lunchtime Learning Session. That's a mouthful. The presentation series offers a unique opportunity for current and potential students and faculty and staff to gain insight into ongoing projects, research methodologies, and emerging trends. I'm Regina Garza Mitchell. I'm a professor in the program, and I'll just take a moment in case not everybody is familiar with it to say that the EMR certificate and degree programs seek to develop scholars, evaluators, and leaders who have a comprehensive understanding and ability to integrate and utilize inquiry methods for multiple ontologies, epistemologies, and paradigms to address research and evaluative questions directed toward understanding and solving pressing problems and contributing to the knowledge base that informs practice. The 3 dimensions of EMR are fully integrated into our MA and Ph.D. programs, and we have 3 certificate options available focusing on qualitative research, mixed methods, and evaluation. For online or on-campus enrollment, you can visit our website to learn more. Our presenter today is Keith Fredlund, a Ph.D. student in the EMR program and data scientist. Keith holds degrees in the fields of music, mathematics, and biostatistics, and his work blends disciplines while aiming to ask fresh questions. Keith approaches his research by exploring the ways that rarely used statistical techniques can shed light on underexamined fields. His projects have ranged from studying inter-rater reliability in competitive Irish dance to applying Hofding's D to broaden our understanding of the way daylight savings affects animal drug trials and examining how seasons may shape mass shooting events. Outside of his academic life, Keith serves on the board of the St. Louis Box Society and represents the U.S. on the national kettlebell sport team. So see, we can do more than just research. His presentation today is titled Comparing Bias in the Textual Output of Generative AI, and I'm turning it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Regina. Appreciate that.
Regina, do you want to record?
It's recording.
Oh, great.
Great. Thanks for checking that, Gary. I'll share my deck here. There'll be about 35 minutes of presentation, and after that, we can kind of dig into the core of the material and discuss a little bit. 2,000 years ago, give or take, a new type of story, the story of Talos, circulated among the Greeks. The central conceit of this Talos story was new for the people. He was a bronze construct, a guardian of Crete, and able to speak and interact like a man. I think of this as the first time that people dreamed of a generalized artificial intelligence. The dream did not die, and now millennia later, we are in a new age of synthetic intelligence. Thanks for joining me today. We're going to take some time to excavate, to really dig into one small question related to a subset of AI called generative AI. I hope as you explore this with me, it will feel just a little bit magical for you, just like the stories of Talos might have felt for the people of Greece. You heard a bit about my background earlier. This is my 2nd year of the evaluation, measurement and research program, PhD program here at Western Michigan University. It's been a great ride so far. I'll apologize if my accent is just a little bit difficult to understand. I sound something like my father, who grew up in a small community in central Saskatchewan in Canada. This ties into the discussion we're having today because a few years ago, devices from Amazon and Apple came out that had the uncanny ability to understand and interpret human speech and then respond back as well. It really felt like a rudimentary form of intelligence. But here's the thing. Those devices, as wonderful as they were for other people, never seemed to be able to understand my accent. And I think that that prompted me to do some of my first thinking about the nuanced behavior of AI. So we're going to look more at that nuanced behavior today. I always appreciate a good disclaimer. My views, of course, are only my own and not those of my employer. I'll add that any errors you see here are all my own responsibility and not because of anything I learned or didn't learn well at any of the schools I attended. So what are we looking at today? There's a lot of words in this title. At this point in time, most of the work of generative AI is still to produce textual output. Information is entered into kind of a chatbot or a textual prompt field, and then generative AI outputs text. What we're going to do is look at one way to measure that output mathematically and ask if the scores we get from that measure change over time. And the bias, in this case, the bias is kind of a mathematical idea, is how much does that, do those responses shift and change over time in what may be an unexpected way. 5 parts to today's discussion. And if you love charts, you're going to get a bunch of those in part 3. You're going to be particularly satisfied if you like density plots. Part 4 is going to be my favorite because I love when we talk about weaknesses. Gary, maybe I see your hand up. Was that still? Okay, that's great. I can only see a little bit of the chat, but thanks. And really, everyone, I love a good interruption as well. So feel free to jump in if you ever need a clarification or want to prompt a question along the way. In regard to weaknesses, there are trade-offs in every analysis, and there are enough steps in this analysis that there are lots of judgment calls that needed to be weighed along the way. So there are lots of reasons to call the findings into question. So I love that sort of discussion as well. All the methodological decisions were made for particular reasons. But even when you have an approach that looks like best practice, there are going to be flaws or weaknesses. All right, let's see what we got next here. All right, so what's the core question we're looking at? Broadly, we want to know whether generative AI develops any types of biases or shifts away from a starting point over time. But that's too kind of large and too broad a question for us to tackle all at once. So we're going to focus down on one particular aspect and try to answer that. We're not going to answer questions about accuracy or reliability, relevancy, or even, for instance, political lean. Those are important questions. We're going to leave those to a future study. Instead, we're going to look at the emotional tone. So something called, using something called a sentiment score. And we're going to derive that by conducting a sentiment analysis. We'll pull samples, i.e. we're going to enter a question into prompts, into the prompt field, get a response back, and then use this analysis to find what the score is for that prompt, and then do that repeatedly so we get a collection of data. We're not going to look, when we look at those samples, we're not going to look first at the central tendency or the middle point, the mean or the median. Instead, we're focusing on comparing distributions. So the shape of responses that we get as we get those scores in from repeated questioning of the AI. So if a group of responses that we get, if we put it into a chart, starts to look like a normal distribution at the beginning, but maybe at the second kind of period we study, that shape is no longer normal, but maybe it's bimodal, that's a change that we'd be quite interested in. And it's the sort of thing that if we were only testing for central tendency, of course, we might miss. So if we're only thinking, let's check for central tendency, the mean can be the same for something that's bimodal in distribution as it is for something with a normal distribution. And we'd want to detect more than that. We're going to compare a few different LLMs, and I'll show them here in a little bit, or types of generative AI. You'll probably recognize them as I show them. And as I alluded to earlier, we're going to cover 2 different sample periods, kind of a first period and then a later period as well. And why do we care about this? So imagine your organization that has set up an AI chatbot to interact with customers wanting help buying cars. You set up your generative AI, you've tested with a series of questions when you first set it up, but you've got it kind of configured so it has the tone of a confident and knowledgeable and eager to help person. You get that dialed in, you stop testing because it's all working great. You think it's going to be stable. But after a few months, you get reports from people saying sometimes your eager AI helper is actually quite sullen. And it might be even more jarring or complicated to understand what's happening if sometimes it's pleasant and upbeat and sometimes it's quite negative. And that would be that bimodal distribution I mentioned earlier. Right now, many organizations test for accuracy and relevance, and may not even be really testing tone very often, but they often do it just at the beginning when they set up and not ongoing. This study we're doing here will reveal if there's something of a risk there. So let's talk about how we look at this. As I said, we're going to look at multiple large language models. And I picked multiple, not just one, so we kind of have a broader sense of what might be happening with this technology. This is a new field. I haven't seen other people do this work. I really think of this as a pilot study. In terms of sample sizes, I think what I've chosen are relevant for this purpose. But of course, we might see different effects if we used larger sample sizes. And I only chose 2 periods because that gives us something that's very easily interpretable, very digestible, but there would be value at studying more time periods or lots of iterations along the way, something more like a more continuous examination. I may have gotten just a little bit ahead of myself and not explained enough what generative AI is. It's a form of artificial intelligence. It produces what seems like creative content, often textual, in response to the prompts or instructions we give it. It learns from seeing patterns in the text it takes in from many sources. Those are books, internet pages, a wide variety of records. The text that it AIs that generate text tend to focus on deep learning models for their training, trained on immense amounts of data. It's sometimes quantified as percentages of all the data that's ever been created by humanity. It captures a good amount of that. Examples of this generative AI that focus on text include things like ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, and Copilot. Within each of those areas, there are kind of 4 specific models that I chose for this study. And just in terms of pronunciation, you may be wondering, how do I pronounce that first one? That's OpenAI GPT 4.0 rather than, for instance, 4.0. You'll see this later, but I didn't compare across models. So you can imagine some forms of experimental design would have set up some sort of ANOVA, for instance, to do a comparison between groups or between models. But in fact, that's not what we care about. We're only going to be looking within each model, the first and second period. One of the major considerations is that I wanted to test within the same model number. So I'll just go back one slide. So this is OpenAI GPT 3.5. Those big numbers, 3.5, change periodically, and I wanted to make sure that I kept this study within one single major model, or within the model number. And the reason for that is I think there's an assumption that the models are pretty stable within one model number without a big change. And I think it will surprise people if we find that there's shifts within that small area. So the nuanced question we're looking at here is whether there's a shift while the model number stays the same, but over time. So I collected all my first samples around June 4th, and then the second around July 28th. I was worried that if I waited longer than 2 months, I'd lose access to a bunch of models as they improved and switched model numbers. And in fact, that was a real risk. It was not long after July 28th that a number of the models kind of flipped out of availability. This is the prompt that I use, kind of everything on the right-hand side. Really the most important thing, I just asked for it to create a summary. The very top line is key. That's me telling it to kind of forget what's been done before. So I don't want it, for instance, to say, oh, Keith, you've asked for this very prompt in the past, so I'm going to intentionally change my answer in response to what I think you want. I want that not to happen. So I've said, hey, please make this a first-time request. In that prompt, there was mention of a PDF that was being analyzed. For this, I wanted to focus on a single article from Wikipedia, and I wanted it to be consistent over the 2 analysis periods. So what I did was I captured that article at the beginning of the first period, saved it as a PDF so that it didn't change over time. I'll acknowledge there is some chance that when you read a PDF into a large language model, that there are characters in there related to the formatting that are kind of read into the model. But I think that's okay on the assumption that those are going to be the same for the first period and for the second period, and we're just interested in consistency there. I also wanted the article to be kind of emotionally charged a little bit, so I chose one about crime in the United States. As I mentioned, we're conducting analysis mainly to see if the distribution of responses has changed over time. Our primary concern is not a shift from left to right along a scale of negative to positive in those sentiment scores, although I will report on that a little bit later on. And we're using a particular type of sentiment analysis called Suzette. And we can thank Russian formalism for the idea of Suzette, which kind of arose in the early 1900s, and it means the artistic arrangement or the presentation of events in creative writing, and really is a measure of a certain type of emotion, positive or negative emotion. I used the Suzette package available in R, developed in 2015 by this fellow here, Matthew Jockers, at the Nebraska Literary Lab. Although it's often used for literary analysis, it's also recommended for sociological analysis, which is why I used it here. Now, the score you get from this is not set from -1 to 1, for instance, but rather you get a decimal value that represents the sum of all sentiment scores in your text. There's no maximum positive or negative value. And already some of you are thinking, oh, there's going to be problems with this analysis because of that. Because we haven't set the length of the summaries that were going to come out. So because those summaries can be of varying length, I scaled the Suzette scores by dividing the Suzette score by the number of sentences in the entire summary. So really the score you're going to be seeing here is the average Suzette score or the average sentiment score per sentence. And I think that's an appropriate way to do this. There are critiques of the Suzette method by Annie Swafford that came out almost immediately after this R package came out. Sometimes it has problems with parsing around quotation marks. It has some context blindness, so sarcasm might be missed. And then some people think it's a bit overly simple. I conducted the sentiment analysis with 30 samples for each of the LLMs for each period. That's a total of 240 observations or outputs. Why 30 in a sample? So this is a pilot study. I didn't know how significant of a difference I should be expecting or looking for. But sample size is still relevant, and we had to have reasons for why I chose the size I did. Sample sizes as large as 4 or 5 might have allowed some kind of 2-sample median comparison tests. But of course, I wanted to look at distribution, and we need far more samples than just 4 or 5 for that. At 30 observations, we have at least some confidence that based on the central limit theorem, we can start to approximate normality if we were to decide to use parametric tests along the way. Most importantly, though, the core distributional test that I'm going to be using is generally reliable for 20 or more observations in a sample. In retrospect, I may have bumped it all the way up to 50. I think there's some people who think that gives greater reliability, and I buy that. If we got into very large sample sizes toward 1,000, we'd have problems with sensitivity that's too high. So we'd be detecting differences that are really trivial, but I don't think we're running the risk of that here. One additional note, which is a bit embarrassing, is related to the O4 mini model. I realized after I'd collected my second group of samples that I had only managed to grab 22 samples rather than 30 for that one model for the later period. Not my best work. I would have gone back and recollected, but I was more concerned about the passage of time than I was about unequal sample sizes, and 22 is probably still sufficient, so I proceeded that way. All right, these two guys. Andrei Kolmogorov, Soviet topology and statistics expert, he developed a one sample goodness of fit test in 1933 that allowed you to compare a distribution, and your ears should pick up, that's what we're interested in here today, between a sample and a theoretical distribution. So a sample and, say, a normal distribution. On the right, Nikolai Smirnov developed a similar test, but now it was an independent two-sample test, and he did that in 1939. The test we use nowadays that combines their ideas, called Kolmogorov-Smirnov, and I love the intensity that these two bring to their pictures. A little less intense are these three, Frank Wilcoxon, Henry Mann, and Ransom Whitney. Together, they put together a test you're probably familiar with, the Wilcoxon-Mann-Whitney, that is, instead of a test of distribution, a test of central tendency that's often used in non-parametric situations. So why did I choose, once again, Kolmogorov-Smirnov over Mann-Whitney? Well, Kolmogorov-Smirnov tests whether two samples come from the same overall distribution. That means it detects things like a change in distribution shape, spread, location, or central tendency, whereas the Mann-Whitney U only focuses in on the median and only looks for a shift in that. The KS test, if you're wondering how it's actually functioning, what it's looking for is when we superimpose two density plots over each other, what is the vertical maximum distance between any 2 points on that density plot? And when I show those graphs, you'll immediately start to see what that means. Mann-Whitney functions quite differently. It ranks all the observations in a single set and then compares the sum of those ranks for each sample. It's a very different approach. All right, coming into results. When I think of those ancient Greeks hearing about Talos, I can imagine them getting quite excited. In some ways, I think the graphs are the modern equivalent of ancient storytelling. So if you like graphs, the way ancient Greeks like their stories, this next section is for you. All right, here's the first result. In this case, GPT-4o, the first period is the darker area. It has the higher peak and was a little more negative. The second period not only shifted toward the right, the positive side, so had more sentences that had more positive words in them, or sorry, had sentences with positive words in them more than the other. And has this large shoulder off to the right-hand side as well. So I look at this and I think my eyes are telling me these are different distributional shapes. Sure enough, I run Kolmogorov-Smirnov, and what our eyes tell us is what in fact is happening per this statistical test. I did a Bonferroni correction as well for multiple comparison. And this is significantly different at an alpha of 0.05. The p-value is far less than 0.01. So a first bit of evidence that there's a difference in distributions. Next up, O4 mini. In this case, it looks like we have different distributions as well. I'll point out both the X and Y axes have changed a bit here, right? They're not the same as they were before, but I hardly want you to pay attention to that because the primary concern we have is not kind of between the models, right? But within each model, the first and second period. And we're interested in shape, right? Not how negative or positive it necessarily was on the scale. I find it interesting that each model now between the first one and the second here is giving us a different distribution. That's like, I'm not sure what that means. It's not part of this research, but gosh, there's opportunity there for further study. Kolmogorov-Smirnov, once again with the Bonferroni correction, rates is significant. The p-value is very, very far below 0.01. Next up, in this case, we see another very different shape. We see that darker area has a shoulder this time on the left, right? So a very high peak and then shoulder off to the left. And those of you who are attentive to this sort of thing will have noticed that the first two, the initial distributions tend to be more negative and then move toward the right. In this case, it's the other way. So the first distribution is farther to the right and the second one's to the left, so more negative. Once again, the test came back, Kolmogorov-Smirnov. This is saying that we reject the null. P-values very far under 0.01. I glossed over it just a little bit. I am using Bonferroni corrections here for multiple comparison. I'm going to acknowledge this is a very conservative approach, and I'll kind of address it more later. All right, the last of these comparisons, also quite different from what we've seen before. You know, we have such a tight cluster of scores in one area for GPT 3.5. The KS test, once again, says highly significant. In all four cases, we've rejected the null that these distributions are the same. So I feel like we've got initial evidence here that within a short period of time, kind of about 2 months, the distributions of these sentiment scores are changing. And I'll just recall for you again, this is within kind of numbered models that to the general public look the same. And yet something is changing under the hood. I said before that my major interest was in distribution of responses, but I will speak here a bit to central tendency. In each case, I tested with Shapiro-Wilks for normalcy and then a Levine's test as well before I decided whether to use a Welch test, which is a type of t-test, or a Wilcoxon-Mann-Whitney test. And I realized I didn't speak to what a Welch test is earlier, but you can just think of it as a t-test. It's parametric, and maybe I left it off because I find parametric tests less interesting than the non-parametric tests like Wilcoxon, Mann-Whitney. Welch test, of course, checks for difference in mean, whereas Wilcoxon, Mann-Whitney checks for difference in median. All right, so visually here, we have these interquartile ranges that are not, I'm going to say not really overlapping, maybe they just barely, which is a hint already that we're going to think, oh, this is probably a significant difference. And in fact, the Wilcoxon-Mann-Whitney test reinforces what we see visually, saying that there is a significant difference between these two. And the p-value is far below 0.01. For the O4 mini, same question applied here. Once again, our eyes tell us there's a difference, and Wilcoxon-Mann-Whitney comes back and saying these medians are significantly different, even more so, in fact, than our last one. Third one, very consistent finding here. Once again, there are significant differences. I'll mention all the Levine's tests I did as well were not significant. And you can see here what looks like a significant difference between the two samples. Mann-Whitney U comes back to indicate it's significant as well. Last one. This is a bit of a different bird. So when we think about interquartile range, which is the area that's shaded in both of these, for the first time, we have what looks like a reasonable amount of crossover between these things. And although I always say run a statistical test to check, you should maybe get a bit of a hint that it may come back as not significantly different if there's crossover of those interquartile ranges. And in this case, what I did was a Welch test, and in fact, it did come back to say that there was not a significant, did not find a significant difference here. or rather, I would say fail to reject. All right, so we've done results. Now on for weaknesses. And I always encourage skepticism of our results when we run experiments. And I think about that of my own work, that there's just lots here that could have been done differently. So I'd encourage everyone too to have that approach with their research. So 3 kind of areas here that I think are worth examining. I use Suzette. This is most appropriate for literature, as I alluded to earlier. Maybe not technical writing, and maybe this is sort of technical writing that was done here. Other people call it out specifically as good for sociological writing. Maybe that's what was happening here, so it's fine. I did also run an analysis with other sentiment methods like Bing and NRC and got this very similar results. So there's some indication that this is persistent across methods. There might be a more perfect sentiment analysis method. I'm actually not sure what that might be. So I'd take advice on that. What's most important, I think, is that we use the same method for all the tests before and after so that it's consistent and interpretable. All right, on to multiple comparisons. Some people might simply have looked at this analysis and said, you didn't need to do any multiple comparison adjustments. And we do multiple comparison, of course, whenever we might be doing enough statistical tests that will start to run into results that look significant just because we're running so many tests. Here, it might be thought of as not a whole bunch of tests on the same data, but actually just one test for distribution on a before and after of one sample, and they just put that in its own box, and then a completely separate experiment on another model before and after. And if we think of it that way, we probably wouldn't want to do multiple comparison kind of adjustments. I did them here just in an overabundance of caution and conservatism. I do not want, I never want my results to just be tricking myself because I found something that was really random. I also could have used other methods. I think that the Bonferroni is appropriate, simple, and strong enough here, but I could have used Scheidak because all the samples are independent, or I could have used Home Bonferroni if, for instance, I was going to have way more comparisons that I was running. I think that would have been appropriate there. All right, the last one thing that we're going to talk about is learning over time. And I mentioned during my methods that I had taken steps, changing the parameters of the models I was using so that they didn't remember, and then also having as part of my prompt, telling it to treat it like a first time question. So I was very concerned that there may be some sort of learning going on over time. Now, learning, mostly we'd think of that in terms of accuracy or relevancy maybe, but I think it's possible to think about learning as a change in sentiment over time to be more like whatever the model thinks I want, right? We look at this plot and visually I think to myself, this looks random, like a random walk, lots of up and down motion. There's a few times where we have trends where it's up, 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 down, down, down. And this is what I'd expect in random fluctuation. Just to be sure, I did run a Pearson correlation to look for a linear relationship, and then also a Kendall's tau to look for a monotonic, or you can think of that as kind of an exponential relationship, either up or down. Non-significant values for both, very non-significant in the range of 0.88 to 0.91 for p-values. So. But here's where things get a little bit interesting. This, I drew this time series over the iterations I did over time for the O4 mini model. And I think I began to convince myself that there was an upward trend here. And in particularly starting at about the 18th point there, it's like we just are going up, 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 down once, up again. This feels like learning, you know, but you know, I put together all these sets. Maybe this is just random. There were just a couple that looked like this. I ran a Pearson test. Of course, it came back significant, as did the Kendall's tau. I didn't pick apart whether or not it's actually really linear or really monotonic, but maybe this just gives us a hint that maybe all the methods I used to try to control the learning were not enough, and that something's happening here. So interesting. But what we're going to come to next is one more chart where things feel a little crazy. It's this one, 2.5 flash, the first period. The opening looks fine. High variability in some subperiods, low variability in some subperiods. But at iteration 21, most of the values start hanging out at negative 0.1. This didn't occur for any other model. But those highly consistent values between 7 and 9 iterations make me raise my eyebrows quite a bit. And I am skeptical about a couple things. So I think one possibility is that I boffed my own data collection somehow. Or that somehow the LLM settings, the parameters were not set the way I thought I had set them, or they reset. Either way, it's curious, and it should lead us to be less confident about my conclusions. All right, where to from here? AI systems are really quite new. And we can't treat them the way we treat systems that we've developed kind of up to this point that are less random, that don't kind of shift and learn over time. We can't just launch systems and stop checking them, even over the short term. So what does this mean? This analysis, or what can we do from here? What other sorts of analysis sort of maybe come to mind as next steps? I measured sentiment analysis, but I'm also curious to see whether we might see shifts with measures of political lean, because I think we'd all be quite interested in that as well. Is that if your chat bot that you set up for your company starts getting more and more right wing or left wing, and it doesn't even need to be polarized just along those two planes, it could be along any other plane, like it becomes, slightly more or really, really favorable to certain family arrangements, right, over time. That'd be something that, gosh, that's a shift that would be surprising. There also, as we saw, there may be some learning effects going on, and I think it's worth maybe digging in more to see, even if we tell LLMs not to learn, if there is actually some learning going on. And I have some suspicions from this work and from other work I've done that there is. Another thing we might do is that often these LLM models have the opportunity to turn down randomness. That's often called the temperature of the model. And I have some suspicion that instead of what most companies want when they do that, which is just a really tight response in a normal distribution, what they are likely to get instead is a bimodal response. So like when the AI is making decisions about what direction to head, they aren't very random, but it still has to pick from two at the beginning. And often those two are quite spread apart. And so you'll end up with a first decision along the chain of responses that creates the text that will drive a bimodal response rather than the normal response that I think some organizations would be looking for. So here's maybe, we can open this up to any sort of discussion at this point, but here are some questions that I'd be very interested in from the group. Do you have any suspicions as to what is leading to the differences in the distributions over time? So like, why would sentiment change from a beginning period to a subsequent period? Also, if you have suspicions about what went wrong in the analysis, kind of in those areas where it was either learning or going flat, love to hear about that. Or if you have some ideas on what else needs to be studied, it would be great to hear about those as well. So I'll stop sharing and open a bit to the group. Nick?
That was just me clapping, but I do actually have a question about yes. So in terms of your prompt to say, hey, let's start fresh, forget everything that I've told you before, I assume you were doing all of this on a singular account. Is that accurate?
No. So
Were you using an
between,
API? Yeah.
sorry, yes, I was not using an API, and that maybe is a big part of your question, and that is
Yeah.
is important to hit. I did not set up separate APIs for each of these. Different accounts per model, for sure. Within each model, I have I kept the same account.
Hmm.
Yeah. So I did start new conversations each time.
Right.
So that may tamp down on the learning. And when I had done some initial pilot work to just check for learning, because I didn't see any, I thought, oh, the methods I've adopted are good enough. It was only later when I'd done more iterations that I started to think, oh, is it not enough?
Yeah.
Applegate.
Yeah, thank you, Keith. Interesting presentation. So do we know what the population basis of sentiment is? I sense the answer is probably no. And so, you're kind of talking about drift. And I wonder if the general sentiment is shifting in a direction more than not. So if you think about I can't think of the word, the general media, no, that's not the right, what is the word? I can't think of the right word. The general sentiment of world conversation as your population. And as different, mostly political changes occur, that may shift along a continuum from positive to negative. And so even within a short period of time, if that background is not stable, it could be influencing to some degree not only the direction, but more the magnitude of the direction, if that makes any sense.
I think it's very possible. You can tell I was concerned so much with controlling the influence my own actions had on the sentiment scores over time. But I'm just one set of queries over millions of people using this technology.
Yeah, and so if those millions of people are asking primarily negatively based queries or primarily positively based queries, is that pushing the distribution of sentiment in general?
Yeah, I think this is a very good question. Yep.
So there's a thought. Thank you. Somebody else?
Gary.
Thanks, Keith. That's really fascinating. Very, very fascinating research. And I'm not an AI person at all, but the things I come across are kind of shocking to me. But one thing that I learned was that, and this was a year ago, but the estimate from AI people was that the LLMs are based on 80%, something like that, of the English language. Okay. And 60% total of materials from USA. So I was in China at the time, and that was kind of a discussion there that they're using AI as well, but a lot of what is happening is that it's not really based on, it's very biased towards an American source. And just if you're looking at, your the sources are going to diversify. There will be more and more languages that are better represented over time. That's the anticipation but initially that's certainly a limitation. But I wonder if as more languages, more cultures are having space in these LLMs, is that going to lead to changes in sentiment, changes in the distributions that you might get just because of the change of the data sources?
Yeah, I think this is a very good question and could very well be the case. Yeah. Or that there'll be a hiving off. Do I think that's what would happen? I think it's unlikely that there'd be a different LLM for the United States than for other countries. I think that's maybe unlikely, but maybe. Yeah, very good point, though.
So what would your recommendations be for somebody that is utilizing sentiment analysis as a primary research tool?
Oh, yeah. Um, I see sentiment analysis used in corporate settings and some research settings in a fairly unexamined way. So my work, it didn't matter what sort of sentiment score we were using because we were just doing pre and post, wanted to be consistent. But I think people just choose a sentiment analysis method, think that they're all as good as all the rest, and go forward. And really, there are significant differences between them in methodology and scoring, and even how small the lexicons are. So often they just compare words in text to a lexicon of words that have been previously scored, but often there's only 4,000 or 3,000 words in there, or 7,000. And so I am always a little reticent about that. Sometimes up to 14,000. I think some of the larger ones I've seen. But maybe other people in this group have more experience than I with this. Gary, was that you offering to? Oh no.
I think, there are certain sentiment algorithms that are lexicon based, and there are other sentiment algorithms that are less lexicon based, I guess you would say. And those lexicons are in many ways domain driven, and perhaps domain restricted, therefore. But that wasn't where my next question was going. So your parsing was at the sentence level, not at the phrase level within a sentence. So there's lots of ways to parse a corpus. And I'm unfamiliar with the particular sentiment algorithm that you used. And so to me, parsing is probably the most important decision that you're going to make going into a sentiment analysis, because that's going to give you, that's essentially your unit of analysis. And luckily, you didn't have any clustering effect. But if somebody is using sentiment analysis to parse interviews or something like that, you have a pronounced clustering effect due to the interview interviewer, interviewee, interviewer exchange. So that dyad creates a clustering effect that absolutely affects the parsing. And so, again, how we interact with these different tools, I think what you're laying out is some really rich space to, I would probably lean towards simulation, although I have yet to really see an high reality correspondence with sentiment analysis simulation. Haven't yet seen that. That in and of itself is a challenge, I think. But I think you're laying out, and if you move down this road further, I think that identifying some major axes to focus your manipulation around would be a good idea, if that makes sense.
Yep. I think there's a world in which if I just bump up the sample size significantly, repeated measures becomes a great tool to analyze this.
Yeah, I mean that's a great idea. I mean, the idea, pre-test, post-test is great, tells you about change, maybe. Doesn't tell you really, my foundation in analytics really, I guess you could say, is experimental psychology, and it was drilled into my head, always have 3 time points as a minimum, not 2. And so, stretching that out, I think would be really interesting. And, so, I guess you can see where that goes.
Yeah, love it. Yeah. Gary, did you have something there?
Yeah, I was just thinking about what you've invested in this project, this research, in terms of time and thought and all that. It just seems like you've done a lot of work to think about this. And I'm just curious now that you've gotten your head around this and you're seeing other ways that you can control the design, how much time would it take you to make adjustments and rerun all this? I know you have the time lapse thing, but I mean, I'm wondering if there's some measure that you can say, yeah, this would take me a quarter of the time to replicate this with doing the same things but making adjustments.
Yeah, far less. So all the coding is done. It's under 1,000 lines of code to put this all together. All the graphs are automated. All the analysis decisions are automated. It is just this. Yeah, a couple mornings, a couple weekends, maybe. Could rerun this with different settings, different parameters. Not bad. As Nick alluded to at the beginning in his question, if I were to set up APIs, which has a different cost base, that might speed things along even more. So instead of a couple mornings, it could be near instant, small, and by some cost, probably under $100. Just the time to set up all the API connections, which can take time and to test and do correctly. Yeah, so not bad off the start. And in fact, I've kind of shopped this around to one conference, got a decline, but I'll shop it around to some others to present to those as well.
Well, thank you very much, Keith. It was an very interesting presentation.
Oh, thanks very much. As you can tell, I just find this very exciting, and I feel like we are knocking on the door of the future. So love that.
Well, thanks for leading the way in this. This is pretty interesting, and you may get questions from the audience later too.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you very much. I think we're near the toward the end of the hour here, so that's great.